In the quiet shadows of history, there exists a place that whispers to us across 5,000 years. A land cradled between two ancient rivers where the first human dreams of permanence took root in fertile soil. Let us journey back, far back, to a time when the world was young and humanity stood at the threshold of its greatest transformation. Picture, if you will, the year 10,000 BCE. The great ice sheets that had gripped the northern world were retreating, pulling back like an exhausted giant finally releasing its hold on the Earth. As the planet warmed and shifted, a miraculous geography emerged in what we now call the Middle East. Two rivers, born in the mountains of Anatolia, carved their way through an arid landscape, creating a ribbon of possibility through an otherwise unforgiving desert. The Tigris and Euphrates, their names echo through time like an ancient prayer. These rivers flowed not with the predictable gentleness of the Nile, but with a fierce, unpredictable temperament that would shape everything that followed. Each spring, mountain snowmelt would swell their banks, sending torrents of water cascading across the flat, alluvial plains. This flooding brought both blessing and curse, depositing rich, dark silt that transformed barren land into fertile ground. Yet threatening to sweep away anything built upon its banks, the Greeks would later call this region Mesopotamia, meaning simply the land between rivers. But there was nothing simple about what would unfold here. This was the Fertile Crescent, a great arc of arable land stretching from the Persian Gulf to the eastern Mediterranean, where wild grasses grew in abundance and animals gathered to drink from life-giving waters. For millennia, humans had wandered these lands as nomads, following herds of gazelles and wild cattle, gathering wild wheat and barley that grew in scattered patches. They moved with the seasons, carrying their entire world on their backs, leaving no permanent mark upon the earth. They knew the rhythm of migration, the ancient dance of pursuit and survival that their ancestors had performed for hundreds of thousands of years. But something was stirring in the human spirit. Perhaps it began with a simple observation that seeds dropped accidentally near a campsite would sprout the following season. Or maybe it was the realization that young animals, captured and kept, could be tamed and bred. Whatever the spark, it ignited a revolution that would change the course of human existence forever. The transformation did not happen overnight. It unfolded slowly, tentatively across generations. Small bands began to linger near the rivers during certain seasons, returning year after year to the same locations where wild grains grew thickest. They experimented with scattering seeds deliberately, with capturing young sheep and goats, with staying just a little longer each year. The land itself seemed to encourage this shift. Unlike the unpredictable rainfall of surrounding regions, the rivers provided reliable water. The annual floods, though dangerous, followed a pattern that could be learned and anticipated. The soil, renewed each year by nutrient-rich silt, yielded abundant harvests for those willing to work it. It was as if the earth itself was extending an invitation: stay, build, grow roots as deep as the grain you plant. And so, slowly, humanity accepted that invitation. They began to construct more permanent shelters, to clear land for cultivation, to dig the first tentative irrigation channels that would carry river water to their fields. They domesticated wheat and barley, transforming wild grasses into reliable crops. They tamed sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs, creating living larders that walked on their own legs. This was the Neolithic Revolution, and nowhere did it unfold with more profound consequences than in Mesopotamia. For in choosing to settle, in learning to shape the land rather than simply move across it, humanity was making a choice that could never be unmade. They were trading the freedom of the nomad for the security of the farmer, the limitless horizon for the bounded field. Yet in this trade lay the seeds of everything that would follow. Civilization itself was being born in these muddy fields between two rivers, though those first farmers could never have imagined what their descendants would build. They knew only that the soil was rich, the rivers were life, and for the first time in human history, staying in one place no longer meant starvation. The stage was set. The land had been chosen, and humanity, unknowingly, had taken its first steps towards cities, writing, law, and empire, all of it beginning here, in the embrace of two ancient rivers flowing endlessly toward the sea. Time, as it often does, had other plans than anyone could have imagined. From the scattered villages and small towns of Mesopotamia, something unprecedented was about to emerge, something that had never existed in all the long millennia of human wandering across the earth. The world's first true city was rising from the mud and ambition of the southern plains. Around 4000 BCE, in the region the Sumerians called Sumer, a settlement called Uruk began its transformation from town to something magnificently larger. Located near the Euphrates River in what is now southern Iraq, Uruk would grow to become not just a city, but the very definition of what a city could be. Here, civilization in its truest sense was being born, and with it would come innovations that still shape our world today. By 3200 BCE, Uruk had swelled to encompass over 6 square kilometers, encircled by massive walls that stretched for 9 kilometers. Within these walls lived somewhere between 40 and 80,000 people, a concentration of humanity that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. To put this in perspective, imagine gathering every person from 100 villages into a single place. The noise, the energy, the sheer density of human presence must have been overwhelming to visitors from the countryside. The city rose from the flat plain like a man-made mountain. At its heart stood the White Temple, perched atop a ziggurat, an artificial hill of mud brick that lifted the sacred space toward the heavens. This was not merely a place of worship, but a statement of human capability, a declaration that humanity could reshape the earth itself to reach toward the gods. The temple complex dominated the skyline, visible for miles across the flat alluvial plain, a beacon proclaiming Uruk's power and divine favor. But Uruk was more than monumental architecture. It was a living organism of staggering complexity. Narrow streets wound between densely packed houses, some 2 or 3 stories tall, their mud brick walls painted white to reflect the brutal summer heat. Marketplaces buzzed with activity as merchants haggled over prices, farmers sold their surplus, and craftsmen displayed goods that represented increasingly sophisticated skills: copper tools and weapons, pottery in elaborate designs, textiles dyed in vivid colors, jewelry of gold and lapis lazuli. The social stratification that had begun in the villages now crystallized into something approaching a true hierarchy. At the pinnacle stood the priest-kings, individuals who claimed to mediate between the gods and humanity. Below them came the priests and priestesses who served in the temples, then the scribes and administrators who managed the city's affairs, then the merchants and skilled craftsmen, and finally, the farmers and laborers who formed the broad base upon which everything else rested. This hierarchy was not merely social, but economic. The temples had evolved into vast enterprises, controlling huge swaths of agricultural land, employing thousands of workers, collecting taxes in the form of grain and livestock, and redistributing resources according to complex systems of obligation and privilege. In a very real sense, the temple complexes were the world's first corporations, and their management required innovations in accounting and communication that would change everything. It was this need, the practical necessity of tracking grain stores and land allotments, of recording debts and tributes, that led to humanity's single most transformative invention: writing. Around 3400 BCE in Uruk, scribes began pressing wedge-shaped styluses into soft clay tablets, creating marks that represented not pictures, but ideas and sounds. This cuneiform script, from the Latin word for wedge, was at first purely practical, inventories and accounts. But once the technology existed, it could not be constrained to mere bookkeeping. Within a few generations, scribes were recording not just quantities of grain, but laws, contracts, religious hymns, and eventually stories. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest surviving works of literature, tells of a king of Uruk and his quest for immortality. Though the versions we possess were written down much later, they record traditions that likely date to this early period, when Uruk stood at the height of its power. Writing changed the very nature of human memory and knowledge. No longer did wisdom depend solely on the fragile recollection of individuals, passed orally from generation to generation with all the distortions that entails. Now, knowledge could be preserved with precision, transmitted across distances and through time. A scribe in Uruk could record a contract, and 50 years later another scribe could read it exactly as written. The past became fixed, authoritative, accessible. Yet beneath all this innovation, all this unprecedented concentration of people and power, lay something more fundamental. Uruk represented a new way of being human. In the city, people lived surrounded not by the natural world, but by human construction. They woke not to the sounds of birds and wind, but to the calls of merchants and the rumble of cartwheels on stone. Their lives were shaped not by the rhythms of season and harvest alone, but by the demands of complex social systems, by the obligations of citizenship. By the weight of law and custom, they were, in short, civilized. And civilization, for all its wonders and innovations, came with a price. The freedom of the nomad was irrevocably lost. The equality of the village, where differences in wealth and status had been relatively minor, gave way to stark hierarchies of power and privilege. The intimate connection with the land that farmers maintained was attenuated for city dwellers who might never work a field or tend an animal. But there was no going back. The city, once invented, would prove irresistible. Uruk was not alone for long. Other cities rose across Sumer, Ur and Eridu, Lagash and Nippur, each competing for resources and prestige, each building higher temples and longer walls. The age of cities had begun, and with it, the age of history itself. For in Uruk, with the invention of writing, humanity had finally gained the ability to speak directly to the future. We know the names of Uruk's kings, the measurements of its walls, the hymns sung in its temples. The silence of prehistory was broken at last, and the human voice, pressed into clay tablets by scribes working in the shadow of ziggurats, echoes still across the 4,000 years that separate their world from ours. As one chapter closed, another more profound began. The decision to settle, once made, rippled outward through generations like circles on water, each wave carrying humanity further from its nomadic past and closer to a future none could foresee. By 7000 BCE, small villages had begun to dot the Mesopotamian landscape. These were not yet the grand cities that would rise thousands of years later, but something more humble, more tentative. Clusters of mud brick homes, circular at first, pressed close together for mutual protection and warmth. Each village held perhaps 50 to 200 souls, bound together by kinship and the shared labor of survival. The transformation in daily life was total and irreversible. Where once humans had moved with the seasons, carrying their possessions in leather bags and sleeping beneath temporary shelters, now they woke each morning in the same dwelling, walked the same paths, tended the same plots of earth. This permanence changed everything. It changed how people thought about time, about property, about their relationship to the land itself. For the first time in human history, people could accumulate more than they could carry. Pottery appeared, vessels for storing grain that would have been impossibly heavy for wandering peoples. Storage itself became a concern, and with it came new anxieties and new possibilities. A successful harvest could be kept, saved against future scarcity. Wealth, in its most primitive form, had entered human society. The villages grew slowly, organically, following no master plan but rather the practical needs of farming communities. Fields surrounded each settlement in concentric rings. Closest to the homes grew the vegetables and legumes that required daily attention. Beyond them stretched the grain fields, vast expanses of wheat and barley that turned golden under the harsh summer sun. Further still lay the pastures where domesticated animals grazed, and beyond that, the wild lands where danger and possibility dwelled in equal measure. Life fell into rhythms dictated by agriculture. The year divided itself into seasons of planting and harvest, of flood and drought. Men worked the fields, guided the plough behind oxen, scattered seed with practiced sweeps of their arms. Women ground grain into flour, wove cloth from sheep's wool, shaped clay into pots and bowls. Children learned the skills they would need, watching their parents with careful eyes. Their play a rehearsal for adult responsibilities. But something else was happening, something that would prove as revolutionary as agriculture itself. With settlement came specialization. Not everyone needed to farm. A village could support a potter who did nothing but make vessels, a weaver who produced cloth for trade, a craftsman who fashioned tools from stone and, increasingly, from copper. This specialization created surplus, and surplus created trade. Villages that had once been isolated points in a vast landscape began to connect, to exchange goods and ideas. A farmer in one settlement might trade grain for pots made 2 days' journey away. A shepherd might exchange wool for copper tools forged in a village near the mountains. Networks of exchange, gossamer thin at first, began to weave the isolated settlements into something larger. Religion, too, was transforming. The animistic beliefs of nomadic peoples, which saw spirits in every rock and tree, were giving way to something more structured. The forces that mattered most to farming communities were the rivers, the rain, the sun, the fertility of the soil. These became gods, personified and powerful, demanding worship and sacrifice. Small shrines appeared in the villages, spaces set apart for the sacred, tended by individuals who specialized in maintaining the relationship between the human and divine worlds. Yet life remained precarious. A flood could sweep away an entire village's homes in a single night. Drought could turn carefully tended fields into dust. Raiders from the desert fringes, still following the nomadic life, might descend upon settled communities, taking what others had labored to create. The settled life offered security, but it also made people vulnerable in new ways, and so the villages grew not just outward but upward, constructing walls of mud brick to protect their accumulating wealth. Watchtowers rose at the corners, places where sentries could scan the horizon for approaching danger. The architecture of defense was being invented alongside the architecture of shelter. By 5000 BCE, some of these villages had grown into small towns, home to thousands rather than hundreds. The houses were no longer simple circular huts, but rectangular structures with multiple rooms, some built of baked brick that could withstand the occasional flood. Streets, narrow and winding, connected neighborhoods. Marketplaces emerged where goods and news were exchanged. These towns were the chrysalis from which cities would emerge. They contained within them all the essential elements: permanent settlement, agricultural surplus, specialization of labor, trade networks, organized religion, and social hierarchy. All that remained was for these elements to be refined, expanded, and organized on a scale never before attempted. The transformation from nomad to settler had taken 5,000 years, but it was complete. Humanity had learned to live in one place, to extract reliable abundance from the soil, to build structures that would outlast individual lives. The next leap, from village to city, would happen much faster. for momentum was building, like water rising behind a dam, preparing to burst forth and reshape the world. And so the wheel of fortune turned, carrying Mesopotamia into an age of splendor that would be remembered long after its cities had crumbled into dust. The success of Uruk had proven that cities were not merely possible but powerful, and across the southern plains of Sumer, ambition took root in fertile soil. Between 3000 and 2000 BCE, a constellation of city-states emerged, each one a universe unto itself, each claiming divine patronage and earthly supremacy. Ur rose near the mouth of the Euphrates, its wealth built on maritime trade with distant lands. Eridu, perhaps the oldest of all settlements, claimed to be the very birthplace of civilization, where kingship first descended from heaven. Lagash and Umma glared at each other across disputed borderlands, their conflicts over water rights and territory stretching across generations. Nippur stood apart, a religious center so sacred that kings from rival cities competed for the right to build there, seeking legitimacy from the gods themselves. These were not cities in the modern sense, scattered suburbs surrounding a central core. They were compact, dense, contained within massive walls that separated the civilized world from the chaos beyond. Each city-state controlled the agricultural lands around it, perhaps stretching 20 or 30 kilometers in every direction, and within those boundaries reigned a complete political system. King, priests, administrators, laws, and armies. The Sumerians called themselves the black-headed people, and they believed themselves to be fundamentally different from the nomadic tribes that still wandered the deserts and mountains surrounding their irrigated paradise. They wore their urban identity like a badge of honor. To be Sumerian was to live in a city, to worship in temples, to be governed by written law, to speak a language of sophistication and nuance. And what remarkable cities they built, each one crowned with ziggurats that scraped the sky, massive stepped pyramids of mud brick that served as artificial mountains, bridges between earth and heaven. These were not tombs like the Egyptian pyramids, but temples, dwelling places for the gods who were believed to literally reside within their sanctuaries at the summit. The largest ziggurats rose 30 meters or more, their sides painted in brilliant colors, their terraces planted with trees and gardens that seemed to float in the air. Imagine approaching Ur for the first time, traveling across the flat plain as the sun climbed toward its zenith. First you would see the ziggurat, the great ziggurat of Ur, dedicated to Nana, the moon god. It dominated the horizon, a mountain where no mountain should be, its whitewashed walls gleaming like bone against the harsh blue sky. As you drew closer, the city walls would resolve from the heat shimmer, 10 meters high and thick enough that 2 chariots could pass atop them. Guards would challenge you at the gates, and if your business was legitimate, you would enter into another world. Inside the walls, the noise and smell would overwhelm the senses. The narrow streets, barely wide enough for 2 people to pass, were lined with houses that pressed against each other like teeth. Sewage ran in open channels down the center of these streets, and the air hung heavy with the scent of humanity living in close quarters. Cooking fires, animal dung, sweat, incense from nearby temples. Yet there was vitality here too, an energy born from thousands of people pursuing their ambitions in close proximity. The heart of each city was its temple complex, and these were not merely religious institutions but economic powerhouses. The temples owned vast estates, employed hundreds or thousands of workers, operated workshops that produced textiles and metalwork for trade. The priests were not just spiritual leaders but administrators, accountants, and politicians. They maintained grain stores that could feed the city in times of famine, organized irrigation projects that required the coordinated labor of thousands, and mediated disputes that might otherwise erupt into violence. The Sumerians understood something profound about the relationship between religion and civic order. Their gods were not distant, abstract forces, but intimate presences with personalities, preferences, and demands. Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water, was clever and benevolent. Inanna, goddess of love and war, was passionate and unpredictable. Enlil, lord of wind and storm, was powerful and temperamental. These deities needed to be fed, housed, clothed, and entertained, just like earthly kings, and it was the duty of humans to provide these services. This belief system justified the entire social structure. The priests who served the gods required support. The artisans who made offerings and maintained temples needed resources. The administrators who organized labor and collected taxes were merely servants of divine will. Even the kings ruled not by their own authority but as representatives of the gods on earth. When a king of Lagash went to war against Umma, he did so not for personal gain, but to defend the honor of his city's patron deity. Yet beneath this religious veneer, very human concerns simmered. The city-states competed fiercely for resources, for prestige, for control of trade routes and agricultural land. They formed alliances and broke them, declared wars and negotiated peace, all while maintaining that they acted in service to divine commands. The gods, conveniently, always seemed to want what benefited their city's earthly interests. The Sumerian language, unrelated to any other known tongue, became the language of scholarship and administration. Scribes trained for years in temple schools, memorizing thousands of cuneiform signs, learning to write on clay tablets with the precise pressure and angle that produced clear, lasting text. These scribes were the memory keepers, the bureaucrats, the poets and storytellers who preserved the culture that defined what it meant to be civilized. Women in Sumerian society occupied a complex position. They could own property, engage in business, and serve as priestesses in the temples. High priestesses, especially those dedicated to Inanna, wielded significant political influence. Yet they remained subject to a patriarchal system where men held most positions of formal power. Marriage was an economic arrangement, divorce was possible but difficult, and women's primary value was often measured in their ability to produce legitimate heirs. For nearly 1,000 years, this system of independent city-states defined Sumerian civilization. Kings rose and fell, cities gained and lost preeminence, but the basic structure remained constant. It was a golden age of sorts, a time of relative stability when art flourished, literature was created, and the foundations of civilization were laid deep. But history has a way of disrupting even the most stable systems. Forces were gathering, both within Sumer and beyond its borders, that would eventually unite these fractious cities under a single rule. The age of city-states was approaching its end, though few could have imagined what would follow. For now, in the shadow of their ziggurats, the Sumerians lived, worked, worshipped and dreamed, certain that their cities would stand forever, that their gods would always protect them, that the world they had built was eternal. They were wrong, of course, but their legacy would prove more durable than their cities. The innovations they pioneered, the systems they created, the very concept of urban civilization itself would outlast mud brick and dynasty, echoing forward through millennia into our own time. Meanwhile, forces beyond anyone's control were gathering. For 1,000 years, the Sumerian city-states had existed in their delicate balance of cooperation and competition, each fiercely independent, each convinced of its own supremacy. But the very success of this system contained the seeds of its transformation. The wealth accumulated in these cities attracted hungry eyes, and ambition that most human of qualities was about to reshape the world. Around 2334 BCE, a man emerged from obscurity whose name would echo through millennia, Sargon of Akkad. His origins were wrapped in legend even in ancient times. Some said he was born in secret to a high priestess who could not acknowledge her child, that she placed him in a reed basket and set him adrift on the Euphrates, where he was found and raised by a gardener. The parallels to later stories, Moses, Romulus, and Remus, suggest that perhaps we are hearing not historical fact, but the myth-making that surrounds great men. What we know with more certainty is this: Sargon rose from humble circumstances to become cupbearer to the king of Kish, a Sumerian city. Cupbearer sounds like a minor position, but in ancient courts, the man who tasted the king's wine before he drank was necessarily one of the most trusted individuals in the palace. From this position of proximity to power, Sargon learned the arts of politics and war, studied the weaknesses of the city-state system, and nursed an ambition that would have seemed insane to his contemporaries. He wanted not to rule a single city, but to unite all of Mesopotamia under one crown. The opportunity came when the king of Kish fell from power. Sargon seized control, but rather than settling into comfortable rule of a single city, he immediately began a campaign of conquest unlike anything the region had ever seen. One by one, the great cities of Sumer fell before his armies. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Umma, cities that had stood independent for 1,000 years, were forced to submit to this upstart from the north. Sargon was not simply a conqueror, but an innovator in the art of empire. He understood that conquest was only the beginning. The real challenge was maintaining control over diverse peoples spread across vast distances. He created the world's first standing professional army, soldiers whose loyalty was to him personally rather than to any city or tribal affiliation. He placed Akkadian governors in conquered cities, but rather than simply extracting tribute, he integrated the local economies into a larger imperial system. He moved his capital to Akkad, a city whose precise location remains lost to history, somewhere in central Mesopotamia. From there, his influence radiated outward. His campaigns took him beyond the traditional boundaries of Sumer, north into Assyria, west to the Mediterranean coast, east into Elam. For the first time, the Fertile Crescent was united under a single ruler, and the concept of empire, that one man might legitimately rule over many peoples, was born. The Akkadian language, a Semitic tongue different from Sumerian, began to spread as the language of administration and power. Yet Sargon was clever enough not to attempt to destroy Sumerian culture. He adopted Sumerian gods, maintained Sumerian administrative systems, and presented himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as the legitimate ruler chosen by the gods to bring order and prosperity. His daughter Enheduanna became high priestess of the moon god at Ur, and she was herself a poet whose hymns survive, making her the first author in history whose name we know with certainty. The empire Sargon built lasted beyond his death around 2279 BCE, surviving through the reigns of his sons and grandsons. At its height, it controlled territory from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, encompassing the entire civilized world as Mesopotamians understood it. Trade flourished as never before. Security along the roads allowed merchants to travel safely across vast distances. Standardized weights and measures facilitated commerce. Art and literature reached new heights of sophistication, but empires, like all human creations, contain within them the forces of their own dissolution. Sargon's successors faced constant rebellions from cities that resented foreign rule and longed for their lost independence. The bureaucracy required to administer such a vast territory strained the empire's resources, and always, on the borders, barbarian tribes pressed inward, drawn by the wealth concentrated in Mesopotamian cities. Around 2154 BCE, the Akkadian Empire collapsed under pressure from the Gutians, mountain peoples from the Zagros Mountains to the east. They swept down from the highlands, and the carefully constructed imperial system disintegrated. For nearly a century, chaos reigned as the Gutians ruled portions of Mesopotamia with a heavy hand, while Sumerian cities reasserted their independence in a brief renaissance. Yet Sargon's legacy endured. He had proven that empire was possible, that a single ruler could control vast territories and diverse peoples. Every subsequent conqueror in Mesopotamia and beyond would study his example, would attempt to recreate his success, would claim to be following in his footsteps. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, Alexander the Great, the Romans, all were, in a sense, Sargon's heirs. More fundamentally, Sargon had changed how people thought about political organization. Before him, the city-state seemed natural and eternal. After him, the city-state seemed small and limiting. The idea that humanity could be organized on a larger scale, that ethnic and linguistic differences could be subordinated to imperial unity, that one law could govern many peoples, these ideas, once planted, would never die. In the ruins of Nineveh, archaeologists discovered later inscriptions praising Sargon, written more than 1,500 years after his death. Kings separated from him by 60 generations still invoked his name, still claimed to emulate his achievements. This is the measure of true greatness, not merely to succeed in one's own time, but to become a template for the future, a standard against which all others are measured. Sargon of Akkad, the gardener's son who became the world's first emperor, had achieved a kind of immortality. His empire crumbled into dust, his capital city vanished so completely that we cannot find it. But the idea he embodied, that vision of universal rule, of power that transcends boundaries, that lived on, shaping the course of human history in ways he could never have imagined. He had opened a door through which countless others would march, for good and for ill, carrying the dream of empire into the future. Yet beneath this apparent order, something more profound was occurring. While kings schemed and priests performed their rituals, while farmers tilled their fields and merchants haggled in marketplaces, the Sumerians were quietly inventing the tools and systems that would define human civilization for the next 5,000 years. The wheel. Such a simple concept, so obvious in retrospect, yet it took millennia of human existence before someone in Mesopotamia, around 3500 BCE, realized that a circular object rotating on an axle could transform the way things moved. The first wheels were not used for transportation, but for pottery, allowing craftsmen to shape clay with unprecedented precision and speed. But once the principle was understood, application to transport followed inevitably. Picture the moment when the first wheeled cart rolled along a Sumerian street. The crowd would have stopped to stare at this miracle, a vehicle moving smoothly over the ground, carrying loads that would have required multiple men to transport. Within generations, wheels were everywhere, on carts and chariots, transforming trade and warfare alike. Distance, which had always been measured in the painful steps of human feet or the endurance of pack animals, suddenly contracted. What took days could now be accomplished in hours. The plough, too, was a Mesopotamian innovation, though its invention was driven by practical necessity rather than inspiration. Breaking the hard-baked earth of the Mesopotamian plain with hand tools was brutally difficult work. Someone realized that if you could harness an ox to a pointed implement that bit into the soil, turning and aerating it as the animal walked, a single farmer could work land that previously required many. Agriculture, already productive, became vastly more efficient. Surplus grew, and with surplus came the ability to support ever larger non-farming populations, priests, scribes, soldiers, artisans, rulers. But perhaps the most revolutionary innovation was invisible, abstract, purely conceptual. The Sumerians invented a mathematical system based not on the number 10, which seems natural to us with our 10 fingers, but on the number 60. This sexagesimal system seems strange until you realize its genius. 60 is divisible by many numbers: 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30, making calculations and fractions far simpler than in a base 10 system. This mathematical framework was not mere abstract play. It was developed to solve real problems, measuring fields, calculating grain harvests, tracking time, dividing circles, and this Sumerian innovation survived intact into our present. When we divide an hour into 60 minutes, a minute into 60 seconds, a circle into 360 degrees, we are using a system invented in Mesopotamia 45 centuries ago. Every time you check your watch, you are participating in a Sumerian legacy. The Sumerians also pioneered irrigation on a scale never before attempted. The Tigris and Euphrates were not gentle providers but capricious forces that could bring both abundance and destruction. Learning to manage these rivers required engineering of remarkable sophistication. Canals were dug, some stretching for dozens of kilometers, carrying water from the rivers to fields that would otherwise have been desert. Dikes and levees protected cities and farmland from catastrophic floods. Reservoirs stored water for use during dry periods. This hydraulic civilization required not just engineering, but also unprecedented cooperation and organization. An irrigation system was useless if upstream farmers diverted all the water, leaving downstream fields parched. Canals had to be maintained, cleared of silt, repaired after floods. Disputes over water rights had to be adjudicated. This necessity drove the development of law and centralized authority. Someone had to have the power to enforce sharing, to organize labor for maintenance, to punish those who violated the collective interest, and so emerged the world's first law codes, predecessors to the more famous Code of Hammurabi that would come centuries later. These were not abstract principles but practical rules. If a man blocks a canal and causes his neighbor's field to flood, he must pay compensation. If a builder constructs a house that collapses and kills the owner, the builder shall be put to death. Law, in its original form, was about maintaining the order necessary for complex civilization to function. The Sumerians revolutionized warfare as well. They developed the phalanx, a tightly packed formation of spearmen moving in coordination, protected by large shields that overlapped to create a nearly impenetrable wall. This military innovation required training, discipline, and a level of social cohesion that only cities could provide. Later, they added the chariot, a light, fast vehicle pulled by donkeys and later horses, carrying warriors who could strike and retreat with unprecedented mobility. In metallurgy, Sumerian craftsmen moved beyond simple copper working to create bronze, an alloy of copper and tin that was harder and more durable than either metal alone. Bronze tools held sharper edges longer. Bronze weapons could pierce leather and even copper armor. The Bronze Age, which would dominate the ancient world for over 1,000 years, began in the workshops of Mesopotamian cities. Even beer, that most universal of beverages, was perfected by the Sumerians. They brewed it from barley, flavored it with dates and honey, and considered it not just a drink, but a gift from the gods. The hymn to Ninkasi, goddess of brewing, was actually a recipe encoded in poetry, allowing brewers to remember the proper steps. Workers were often paid partly in beer rations, and temples produced vast quantities for religious festivals. To be Sumerian was, in part, to be a beer drinker. The Sumerians developed the sail, allowing boats to harness wind rather than relying solely on human muscle pulling oars or pushing poles. They created the first schools, temple institutions, where young scribes learned their craft through endless copying of texts, a pedagogical method that would persist for millennia. They invented the lunar calendar, tracking months by the moon's phases, though they had to periodically add extra months to keep their calendar aligned with the solar year and the agricultural seasons. Perhaps most importantly, the Sumerians created the concept of the professional bureaucrat. In earlier societies, leaders were warriors or priests who happened to also handle administrative tasks. In Sumer, administration became a specialization requiring years of training. Scribes learned not just to write, but to calculate, to understand complex legal codes, to manage large organizations. They formed a class of educated administrators who kept cities functioning regardless of which king sat on the throne. These innovations did not occur in isolation, but formed an interconnected web, each development enabling others. Writing allowed for complex administration. Complex administration enabled irrigation projects. Irrigation enabled agricultural surplus. Surplus enabled specialization. Specialization enabled innovation. And innovation drove the cycle forward faster and faster, until Mesopotamia had leapt far beyond any other region on Earth in wealth, power, and sophistication. Yet with all these advances came new challenges. Increased productivity meant increased population, and increased population put ever greater pressure on resources. The irrigation that made Sumer productive gradually poisoned the soil with salt, a problem that would eventually contribute to the region's decline. The military innovations that protected cities from raiders also enabled conquest and oppression. Writing preserved knowledge but also created rigid hierarchies between those who could read and those who could not. The Sumerians had opened a door that could never be closed. They had proven that humans could reshape their world, could create abundance through ingenuity, could organize themselves into systems of breathtaking complexity. Every civilization that followed would build on these foundations, adapting and refining the tools the Sumerians invented. And so we arrive at a profound realization. We are all Sumerians now. Our cities, our laws, our writing, our mathematics, even our 24-hour day divided into units of 60, all trace their lineage back to those ancient innovators working in mud and clay between two rivers. They could not have imagined the world their innovations would create, but they gave us the tools to build it. That is their enduring gift, purchased with centuries of experimentation, failure, and gradual refinement. We stand on foundations they laid, using tools they forged, thinking in systems they invented, forever in their debt. As the years unfolded like pages in an endless book, the center of power in Mesopotamia shifted northward. The great Sumerian cities, though still significant, gradually faded from political preeminence. A new star was rising, a city that had been relatively minor but was about to inscribe its name permanently into human consciousness. Babylon. Located on the Euphrates River in central Mesopotamia, Babylon first emerged as an independent city-state around 1894 BCE, when an Amorite chieftain named Sumuabum established a dynasty there. For over a century, Babylon remained one power among many, competing with Larsa, Isin, and other city-states in the familiar pattern of Mesopotamian politics. But in 1792 BCE, a king ascended the throne who would transform this regional player into the dominant force in the ancient world. His name was Hammurabi, and he would rule for 43 years that changed everything. Hammurabi was that rare combination of brilliant military strategist, cunning diplomat, and visionary administrator. In his early years, he played the game of alliances masterfully, making and breaking partnerships as circumstances required. He allied with one city to defeat another, then turned on his former ally when it served his purposes. Slowly, methodically, he expanded Babylonian control until, by the 30th year of his reign, he had conquered all of Mesopotamia, from the Persian Gulf to Assyria in the north. But conquest alone does not ensure enduring fame. Kings rise and fall, empires expand and contract, and most are forgotten within generations. What made Hammurabi immortal was not his military success, but something far more revolutionary. He created the most comprehensive legal code the ancient world had yet seen, and he had it inscribed on stone monuments placed throughout his kingdom for all to see. The Code of Hammurabi, as it came to be known, consisted of 282 laws covering virtually every aspect of Babylonian life. It addressed property rights, commercial disputes, marriage and divorce, inheritance, slavery, criminal justice, and professional liability. The laws were organized logically, grouped by subject matter, presented in clear language that even common citizens could understand when read aloud by scribes. The most famous principle in the code is the law of retaliation. If a man put out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out. If he break another man's bone, his bone shall be broken. If he knock out the teeth of his equal, his teeth shall be knocked out. This principle, often summarized as an eye for an eye, seems harsh to modern sensibilities, but in its original context it was actually progressive, establishing proportionality in punishment and preventing excessive retaliation. Yet the code was far from egalitarian. Justice was explicitly stratified by social class. If a noble struck a commoner, the fine was minimal. If a commoner struck a noble, the punishment was severe. If a nobleman killed a slave, he merely paid compensation to the slave's owner. The code recognized three social classes: the Amelu, free persons of the upper class; the Mushkenu, free persons of lower status; and the Wardu, slaves. And the value of their lives and dignity was weighted accordingly. The code also reveals fascinating details about Babylonian society. Builders were held to strict standards. If a house collapsed and killed the owner, the builder could be executed. If the owner's son died, the builder's son would be killed. This principle of accountability extended to other professions as well. Physicians who failed to save a patient or caused injury through incompetent treatment faced severe penalties, including having their hands cut off. Women's rights, by ancient standards, were surprisingly robust. Women could own property, engage in business, and initiate divorce under certain circumstances. If a man divorced his wife without cause, he had to return her dowry and provide support. If a man's wife became ill and he wished to take a second wife, he was required to continue supporting the first. Adultery by women was punished by drowning, but men faced consequences too if they falsely accused their wives. The code addressed economic matters with sophisticated understanding. Interest rates on loans were regulated. Merchants who defrauded customers faced penalties. Rental agreements for fields and houses were formalized. Wage rates for various professions were standardized. It was, in essence, an attempt to create a predictable economic environment where business could flourish without constant fear of cheating or arbitrary rulings. What made Hammurabi's code truly revolutionary was not its content. Many of these laws existed in earlier Mesopotamian societies, but its systematic codification and public promulgation. By inscribing the laws on stone stelae placed in public spaces, Hammurabi was declaring that law was not the arbitrary whim of kings or the secret knowledge of priests, but a public standard that applied to everyone, even the powerful. The most famous stela, discovered in 1901 by French archaeologists at Susa in modern Iran, stands over 2 meters tall. At its top is carved an image of Hammurabi receiving the laws from Shamash, the sun god and deity of justice. Below, in elegant cuneiform script, the laws are inscribed for eternity. The prologue declares Hammurabi's purpose: to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, to destroy the wicked and evildoers, so that the strong should not harm the weak. This was propaganda, of course. Hammurabi was establishing his legitimacy, presenting himself as the champion of justice and order. But even propaganda reveals values and aspirations. The idea that rulers should be bound by law, that justice should be predictable rather than capricious, that the purpose of law was to protect the weak from the strong. These were concepts that would resonate through the centuries. Under Hammurabi, Babylon became not just a political capital, but a cultural and intellectual center. The city grew to enormous size, its walls encompassing several square kilometers, its temples magnificent, its markets bustling with traders from distant lands. The Babylonian dialect of Akkadian became the diplomatic language of the ancient Near East. used for correspondence between kingdoms from Anatolia to Egypt. Hammurabi himself was an engaged administrator, not content to simply conquer and delegate. Letters survive showing him personally intervening in local disputes, ordering the construction of canals, ensuring fair treatment of citizens. He cultivated an image of the concerned shepherd watching over his flock, the wise father governing his children. He died around 1750 BCE, having ruled longer than most and accomplished more than nearly any before him. His empire would not long survive him intact. His successors lacked his ability and external pressures mounted, but the Code of Hammurabi endured. Copies were made and studied for over 1,000 years. It influenced later legal systems, including biblical law, and established principles that still resonate in modern jurisprudence. There is something deeply moving about the ambition behind that stone stela. Here was a king who understood that bronze swords rust and clay tablets crumble, but ideas, if carved deeply enough in stone and in human consciousness, can approach immortality. Hammurabi wanted to be remembered not as a conqueror, but as a lawgiver, not as a warrior, but as a bringer of justice. And across 37 centuries, his wish has been granted. We remember Babylon's golden glory dimly, but the Code of Hammurabi remains vivid, a testament to one man's belief that human society could be governed by reason rather than by force alone. But this was only the beginning of a journey that would take Mesopotamian civilization to unprecedented heights of power and depths of brutality. While Babylon basked in its cultural achievements, a different force was rising in the north, one that would come to dominate the ancient world through sheer military might and calculated terror. Assyria, named for the city of Ashur on the upper Tigris River, had existed for centuries as a relatively minor player in Mesopotamian politics. The Assyrians were traders first, their merchants carrying goods along the dangerous routes that connected Mesopotamia with Anatolia and beyond. They learned early that in a world of predatory kingdoms and raiding tribes, survival depended on military strength. Around 1365 BCE, under King Ashur-uballit, Assyria began its transformation from merchant state to military juggernaut. But it was in the centuries that followed, particularly during what historians call the Neo-Assyrian period beginning around 911 BCE, that Assyria became the most feared power the ancient world had yet seen. The Assyrian military machine was unlike anything that came before. Where other ancient armies were largely composed of farmers called up during campaign season, the Assyrians created a professional standing army of unprecedented size and sophistication. At its height, the Assyrian army numbered over 100,000 men, a force so large it could conduct multiple simultaneous campaigns across vast distances. The army was organized with ruthless efficiency. Infantry formed the core, heavily armored spearmen and archers who fought in disciplined formations. Cavalry units provided mobility and shock value, riding in from the flanks to scatter enemy formations. Siege engineers developed advanced techniques for breaching city walls, including battering rams covered in protective hides, siege towers, and tunneling operations. The Assyrians transformed siege warfare from a waiting game into a science of destruction. But technology and organization alone do not explain Assyrian success. What truly set them apart was their deliberate cultivation of terror as a strategic weapon. The Assyrians understood that the reputation for overwhelming violence could be as effective as violence itself. If cities surrendered immediately upon the approach of Assyrian forces, costly sieges could be avoided and resources preserved for further conquest. And so the Assyrians developed a systematic policy of psychological warfare through documented atrocity. Kings boasted in their inscriptions of impaling prisoners on stakes outside conquered cities, of flaying captured rulers alive and displaying their skins on city walls, of creating pyramids from severed heads. They burned cities that resisted, deported entire populations, and replaced them with colonists from other parts of their empire. The message was clear: submit immediately and live under Assyrian rule, or resist and face annihilation. We must be careful here not to view these practices through an anachronistic lens. The ancient world was brutal by our standards, and all powers used violence to maintain control. What distinguished the Assyrians was the scale and systematization of their terror, and their understanding that publicizing atrocities could prevent future resistance. They were not uniquely cruel, but uniquely effective in their cruelty. Under kings like Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon X, and Sennacherib, the Assyrian Empire expanded until it controlled the largest territory yet seen in human history. From the Persian Gulf to Egypt, from the mountains of Anatolia to the deserts of Arabia, Assyrian power was absolute. The empire stretched over 2,000 kilometers, encompassing dozens of distinct peoples, languages, and cultures. Maintaining such an empire required more than military might. The Assyrians developed sophisticated administrative systems, dividing their territory into provinces governed by officials directly responsible to the king. They built an extensive road network with relay stations, allowing messengers to carry information across the empire in days rather than weeks. They conducted regular censuses to track population and resources. They created standardized weights and measures to facilitate trade and taxation. The capital cities they built were monuments to imperial power. Nimrud, Khorsabad, and above all, Nineveh were designed to awe and intimidate. Nineveh, the greatest of Assyrian capitals, eventually encompassed over 7 square kilometers within walls that stretched for 12 kilometers. The walls themselves were massive, in places 15 meters thick, punctuated by 15 gates, each protected by colossal statues of human-headed winged bulls called lamassu. Within Nineveh rose palaces of unprecedented grandeur. The palace of Sennacherib contained at least 80 rooms, its walls covered with carved stone reliefs depicting the king's military victories in exquisite detail. These were not merely decorative, but served as propaganda, reminding visitors of Assyrian power and the fate of those who opposed it. The palace also featured advanced engineering, a sophisticated plumbing system, gardens irrigated by an aqueduct that brought water from mountains 50 kilometers away, and sanitation systems that would not be matched in Europe for over 2 millennia. Yet for all their power, the Assyrians remained deeply insecure. Their empire was built on conquest, and every conquered people harbored resentment and dreams of independence. The Assyrian homeland in northern Mesopotamia was relatively small and resource-poor. The empire existed by extracting tribute from subject peoples. This meant constant military campaigns to suppress rebellions, to cow restive provinces back into submission, to demonstrate that resistance was futile. The strain was immense. Kings died in battle or from the stress of constant campaign. Court intrigues and succession crises weakened central authority. The deportation policies that were meant to prevent organized resistance instead created patchwork populations with little loyalty to their Assyrian overlords. The very terror that had built the empire also ensured that any sign of weakness would invite massive rebellion. Moreover, the Assyrians had made enemies everywhere. The Egyptians resented Assyrian interference in their affairs. The Babylonians, despite being fellow Mesopotamians, chafed under Assyrian domination and preserved memories of their own imperial glory. Mountain tribes in the Zagros and Caucasus raided Assyrian territory with impunity. New peoples were migrating into the Near East, bringing with them new military techniques and challenging Assyrian dominance. The Assyrian kings understood this precarious reality. Their inscriptions beneath the boasting about military victories reveal anxiety. They constantly invoke the gods, seeking divine validation for their rule. They emphasize their building projects and pious donations, attempting to present themselves as more than mere warlords. They talk of bringing order and civilization to barbarous peoples, of shouldering the white man's burden thousands of years before that phrase was coined. But history remembers what it will, and the Assyrians are remembered primarily for their military prowess and calculated brutality. They were the Romans before Rome, the Third Reich before Hitler, the empire that made imperialism a science. They demonstrated that a relatively small people, through superior organization, technology, and sheer will to power, could dominate a vast swath of the known world. Their legacy was complex. They spread Mesopotamian civilization across the Near East, exposing diverse peoples to advanced techniques of administration, engineering, and agriculture. They created a cosmopolitan empire where merchants and ideas flowed freely along protected trade routes. But they also perfected techniques of oppression and control that would be studied and emulated by tyrants for millennia. The question lingered in the air like smoke from a burned city. How long could such power, built on such foundations, possibly endure? The answer, as we shall see, was both shorter and more catastrophic than anyone might have imagined. And in this moment of imperial twilight, we glimpse something that transcends conquest and terror, something that speaks to a different kind of ambition. Among the warrior kings of Assyria, one man stands apart, not for his military campaigns, though he conducted many, but for his scholarly passions and his understanding that knowledge itself was a form of power. Ashurbanipal ascended to the Assyrian throne around 668 BCE, inheriting an empire at its absolute zenith. His father, Esarhaddon, had conquered Egypt, the ancient civilization that had stood proudly independent for 3,000 years. The Assyrian Empire now stretched from the Nile to the Persian Gulf, from the mountains of Elam to the shores of the Mediterranean. There was, quite literally, no power on earth that could challenge Assyrian supremacy. But Ashurbanipal, unlike his predecessors, was more than a warrior. He had been educated for the priesthood before unexpectedly becoming heir to the throne, and this education had instilled in him a deep appreciation for learning. He could read and write both Akkadian and Sumerian, a rare accomplishment for royalty in any era. Ancient inscriptions quote him boasting, "I have read the beautiful clay tablets from Sumer and the obscure Akkadian writing which is hard to master. I have had my joy in the reading of inscriptions on stone from the time before the flood." This was no ordinary king. From his palace in Nineveh, Ashurbanipal embarked on one of the most ambitious intellectual projects in ancient history. He sent scribes throughout his vast empire with a single mission: to collect, copy, and bring to Nineveh every significant text that existed. He wanted not just religious texts or royal inscriptions, but everything: scientific treatises, mathematical tablets, medical texts, astronomical observations, literature, mythology, dictionaries, grammatical works, even omen collections and magical incantations. The result was the greatest library the ancient world had yet seen, housed in his palace at Nineveh. At its height, the library contained approximately 30,000 clay tablets, an almost incomprehensible wealth of knowledge. To put this in perspective, this single library contained more written material than would exist in all of Europe 1,000 years later during the Dark Ages. The collection was systematically organized, with tablets catalogued and shelved according to subject. Ashurbanipal's scribes created what we might call a finding system, with lists of contents and notations indicating where specific texts could be found. Many tablets bear the stamp, Palace of Ashurbanipal, King of the World, King of Assyria, claiming ownership over knowledge itself. Among the treasures in this collection was the most complete version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the ancient Mesopotamian tale of a king's quest for immortality. This poem, which dates back to Sumerian times but was refined and expanded over centuries, tells of Gilgamesh's friendship with the wild man Enkidu, their adventures together, Enkidu's death, and Gilgamesh's subsequent journey to find eternal life, only to learn that immortality is reserved for the gods alone. The library also preserved the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that tells how the god Marduk defeated the chaos dragon Tiamat and created the world from her corpse, then fashioned humanity from the blood of a slain god to serve the gods as slaves. These myths, preserved on Ashurbanipal's tablets, would influence later religious and literary traditions in ways the ancient scribes could never have imagined. Scientific and technical knowledge filled the shelves as well. Mathematical tablets showed advanced calculation techniques, including what we would recognize as primitive algebra. Astronomical texts tracked the movements of planets with precision, predicting eclipses and calculating the length of the year to within minutes of modern measurements. Medical texts described symptoms and treatments for hundreds of ailments, though their remedies mixed practical observation with magical incantation in ways that seem strange to modern minds. The library contained historical texts, chronicles of kings and their deeds, stretching back 1,000 years. Royal correspondence gave insight into the workings of imperial administration. Treaties, legal documents, and commercial contracts provided a window into everyday life. Dictionary tablets and grammatical texts showed scribes studying and preserving languages, Sumerian especially, that were no longer spoken but were considered sacred as the languages of ancient wisdom. Ashurbanipal saw his library as more than a repository of knowledge. It was a political statement. By gathering all significant texts, he was claiming Assyrian dominion over not just territory, but over civilization itself. Assyria was positioning itself as the heir to all Mesopotamian tradition, the guardian of accumulated human wisdom. Just as Assyrian armies conquered kingdoms, Ashurbanipal's scribes were conquering knowledge, bringing it all to Nineveh where it would serve Assyrian glory. Yet there was something else at work, something more personal. Ashurbanipal genuinely loved learning. His inscriptions describe the pleasure he took in reading ancient texts, in understanding difficult passages, in adding to his collection. In a world of warrior kings whose primary concern was military glory, here was a ruler who found equal satisfaction in a well-crafted poem or a complex mathematical problem. This passion for knowledge did not make Ashurbanipal any less ruthless in military matters. When Babylon rebelled under his brother Shamash-shum-ukin, Ashurbanipal besieged the city until starvation forced surrender, then destroyed much of it in retribution. When Elam in the east proved troublesome, he campaigned there with such ferocity that the kingdom never recovered. The scholar king was also a warrior king, capable of extreme violence when he deemed it necessary, but the library endured. After Ashurbanipal's death around 631 BCE, the Assyrian Empire he had maintained at its height began to crumble with stunning speed. Internal strife weakened central authority. Egypt broke away. Babylon rose in rebellion. New peoples, the Medes from Iran, the Scythians from the steppes, pressed upon Assyrian borders. In 612 BCE, a coalition of Babylonians and Medes besieged Nineveh itself. The city that had seemed impregnable fell. The palaces were burned, the walls were torn down, the population was slaughtered or enslaved. The great capital of the Assyrian Empire, which had dominated the ancient world for 3 centuries, was so thoroughly destroyed that within generations its location was forgotten, buried beneath sand and grass, a haunted memory in local folklore. But in the burning palace, something miraculous occurred. The clay tablets in Ashurbanipal's library, exposed to intense heat, were baked hard, preserving them far better than if they had been left in their original sun-dried state. When the palace collapsed, it buried the tablets under protective rubble, where they would lie hidden for 25 centuries. In the 1840s and 1850s, British archaeologist Austin Henry Layard and his successors excavated the ruins of Nineveh. They discovered Ashurbanipal's library, thousands of tablets still bearing their text, still telling their stories. These tablets were shipped to the British Museum in London, where they remain today, still being studied, still yielding insights into the ancient world. It is a profound irony. The Assyrian Empire, built with such ruthless efficiency, designed to last forever, collapsed within decades of Ashurbanipal's death. But his library, created as an expression of imperial power, has given Assyria a form of immortality more lasting than bronze or stone. Because of those tablets, we can read Mesopotamian literature in the original languages. We can understand how ancient people thought about the gods, the cosmos, life and death. We can trace the development of mathematics, medicine and astronomy over millennia. Ashurbanipal wanted to be remembered as the mightiest king, the conqueror of nations. Instead, he is remembered as the librarian, the collector, the preserver of knowledge. In this, there is a lesson about what truly endures. Empires fall, dynasties end, armies are defeated. But ideas, stories, and knowledge, if properly preserved, can survive any catastrophe, speaking across millennia to remind us that we are part of a continuous human story that stretches back far beyond our individual lives. There is something eternal about the story of cities rising from the ashes of their destroyers. In 612 BCE, as Nineveh burned and the Assyrian Empire breathed its last, few could have predicted that within a generation, Babylon would emerge as the greatest power the ancient world had yet witnessed. Yet history, which loves symmetry, was preparing one final act of Mesopotamian glory. Babylon had suffered under Assyrian domination for centuries. The proud city that Hammurabi had made supreme, the cultural and religious center of Mesopotamia, had been reduced to a provincial capital, occasionally razed when it dared to rebel. But in 626 BCE, as Assyria weakened, a Chaldean general named Nabopolassar seized power in Babylon and declared independence. He allied with the Medes of Iran, and together they destroyed the Assyrian Empire so thoroughly that its capital cities became legends spoken of in whispers. Nabopolassar ruled for 20 years, rebuilding Babylon's power and prestige, but it was his son who ascended the throne in 605 BCE who would elevate Babylon to heights that would echo through scripture, literature, and historical memory for millennia. His name was Nebuchadnezzar X, and he would reign for 43 years that transformed the ancient world. Nebuchadnezzar was cut from the cloth of the great Mesopotamian kings. He was a brilliant military commander who spent the first years of his reign campaigning across the Levant, crushing resistance, forcing kingdoms into submission. Egypt, that ancient rival, was defeated at the Battle of Carchemish, ending its influence over Syria and Palestine. City after city fell before Babylonian armies. In 597 BCE, the Kingdom of Judah in Palestine rebelled against Babylonian authority. Nebuchadnezzar responded by besieging Jerusalem, the sacred city of the Hebrews. When the city fell, he showed initial mercy, placing a puppet king on the throne and taking only the aristocracy, craftsmen, and religious leaders into exile in Babylon. But when Judah rebelled again in 589 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar's patience ended. The second siege of Jerusalem lasted 2 years. The city was starved into submission. When the walls were finally breached in 587 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar ordered the systematic destruction of Solomon's temple, the holiest site in Judaism, built 4 centuries earlier. The city was burned. Thousands were killed. The survivors, the elite and educated classes of Judean society, were forcibly marched to Babylon, beginning what would be remembered as the Babylonian captivity. This event, traumatic for the Jewish people, would have profound consequences for religious history. In exile, separated from their temple and homeland, the Jews began to compile and codify their scriptures. The Torah took its final form in Babylon. Prophecies of return and redemption were written. Judaism, transformed by exile, emerged from this crucible as a more resilient faith, no longer dependent on a single temple or geographic location. Christianity and Islam, which would grow from Jewish roots, owe their existence in part to what happened in Babylon during these decades. But Nebuchadnezzar saw himself not primarily as a conqueror, but as a builder. The wealth that flowed into Babylon from its vast empire, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, was invested in one of the most ambitious construction programs in ancient history. Nebuchadnezzar was determined that Babylon would be more magnificent than any city that had ever existed, a worthy capital for the empire that now dominated the civilized world. He rebuilt the city on a scale that dwarfed its predecessors. The walls were reinforced and extended until they stretched for 17 kilometers, massive fortifications of baked brick so thick that 2 chariots could race abreast along the top. 8 monumental gates pierced these walls, each a masterwork of glazed brick art. A moat surrounded the outer defenses. Towers rose at regular intervals, positions for archers and spotters who could see enemies approaching from miles away. Within the walls, Nebuchadnezzar constructed palaces, temples, and administrative buildings that represented the pinnacle of Mesopotamian architecture. The main palace complex covered multiple acres, a labyrinth of courtyards, throne rooms, residential quarters, and administrative offices. Excavations have revealed throne rooms large enough to hold thousands of courtiers, walls decorated with glazed brick panels showing lions, dragons, and bulls in vivid blues. Yellows and whites, the southern palace, Nebuchadnezzar's personal residence, featured innovations that would not be seen again in the West for centuries. Advanced drainage systems carried waste away from living areas. Sophisticated ventilation systems cooled rooms during the brutal summer heat. Storage facilities could hold enough grain to feed the city for years. The administrative capability required to manage such a complex was itself a marvel, requiring legions of scribes, accountants, and bureaucrats working from dawn to dusk. Religious construction received equal attention. The Esagila, the main temple of Marduk, Babylon's patron god, was expanded and enriched. Its ziggurat, the Etemenanki, rose 90 meters into the sky, a mountain of baked brick ascending to heaven in 7 levels, each painted a different color. This structure, visible for miles across the flat Mesopotamian plain, may have been the inspiration for the biblical Tower of Babel, that story of human ambition reaching toward divinity. Nebuchadnezzar's inscriptions are filled with religious devotion. Unlike the Assyrian kings who emphasized military prowess, Nebuchadnezzar presented himself primarily as the servant of Marduk, the pious king who restored temples and performed rituals. He claimed divine favor, portraying his conquests not as personal aggrandizement, but as fulfilling the will of the gods who had chosen Babylon to rule the world. Yet beneath the piety lay shrewd political calculation. The deportations of conquered peoples, while brutal, served multiple purposes. They removed potential rebel leaders from their homelands. They brought skilled craftsmen and laborers to Babylon, where they could contribute to its building projects. They created a cosmopolitan capital where diverse peoples lived and worked, their loyalties gradually shifting from their lost homelands to their new home. The exiled Jews, for instance, were not enslaved but allowed to settle in communities, practice their religion, and engage in commerce. Many prospered in Babylon, becoming merchants and even officials in the imperial administration. Some, when given the opportunity to return to Judea decades later, chose to remain in Babylon, which had become home. Nebuchadnezzar ruled until his death in 562 BCE. His reign represented the apex of Mesopotamian civilization, the culmination of 3,000 years of cultural development. All the innovations of the Sumerians, all the administrative genius of the Akkadians, all the military prowess of the Assyrians, all the legal wisdom of Hammurabi, it all came together in the Babylon that Nebuchadnezzar built. He died believing he had created something eternal, a city that would stand forever, an empire that no force on earth could challenge. The inscriptions he left are filled with confidence, even hubris. I have made Babylon the sacred city, the glory of the great gods. I have raised up the summit of the temple of Esagila. I have made Babylon the most admired of the cities of the world. Standing at the pinnacle of his power, surveying the city he had rebuilt, he could not have imagined that his empire would barely outlive his own children, that forces were already gathering that would sweep Babylon away like sand before wind. But for now, in this golden moment, Babylon stood supreme, the wonder of the world, the jewel of Mesopotamia, perhaps the greatest city humanity had yet created. Yet beneath this monumental achievement, beneath the political and military triumphs, lay something more human, more touching. For woven into Nebuchadnezzar's building projects was a love story, or at least a story of love, that would capture imaginations for millennia. Legend tells us that Nebuchadnezzar married Amytis, a Median princess, to seal the alliance between Babylon and Media that had destroyed Assyria. Amytis came from the green mountains of Media, a land of forests and flowing streams, of cool heights and natural beauty. When she arrived in Babylon, she found herself in a flat, dusty plain where the heat shimmered off mud brick walls and greenery was sparse and carefully cultivated. The queen, they say, grew homesick for her mountain homeland, and so Nebuchadnezzar, who could command armies and level cities, who could reshape the very earth to his will, set about creating for his beloved wife an artificial mountain covered in gardens. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, as they came to be known, would be counted among the 7 wonders of the ancient world, spoken of with awe by Greek and Roman writers centuries after they had vanished. The exact location and even existence of the gardens remains a matter of scholarly debate. No Babylonian texts mention them explicitly, which is strange for such a supposedly monumental achievement. Some historians suggest they may have actually been built in Nineveh by an Assyrian king, or that they were greatly exaggerated by Greek writers who never saw them personally. But the legend persists, and if the gardens existed as described, they represented an engineering marvel. Ancient accounts describe a structure built on stone arches, itself unusual in Mesopotamia where stone was scarce and brick predominated. Upon these arches rose terraced levels, each planted with trees, shrubs and flowers brought from across the empire. The highest terraces supposedly reached the height of the city walls, creating the illusion of a green mountain rising from the flat plain. An elaborate system of screws and chain pumps powered by slaves or animals lifted water from the Euphrates River to irrigate the upper terraces, from which it cascaded down in streams and waterfalls. If this existed, it would have been not merely impressive but revolutionary. Creating a sustained artificial ecosystem in the harsh Mesopotamian climate would have required constant attention, vast resources and engineering knowledge far beyond typical ancient capabilities. The psychological impact on visitors would have been profound. Entering Babylon, city of brick and stone, and finding within it this verdant paradise, this triumph of human will over nature. Whether or not the gardens existed precisely as described, they represent something true about Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon. This was a city dedicated not just to military power or administrative efficiency, but to beauty, to the demonstration of what human ambition could achieve. Babylon was meant to inspire awe, to make visitors feel small before its magnificence, and nowhere was this more evident than at the Ishtar Gate, the main ceremonial entrance to the inner city, which did unquestionably exist, and portions of which can be seen today in museums around the world. The Ishtar Gate was perhaps the most spectacular structure in Babylon, certainly the most beautiful. The gate stood 15 meters high, built of glazed blue brick that sparkled in the sunlight like a fragment of sky brought to earth. Against this brilliant blue background, rows of bulls and dragons marched in bas relief, symbols of the gods Adad and Marduk. The bulls were rendered in white and yellow glazed brick, the dragons, mythical creatures with serpentine bodies, lions' forelegs, eagles' talons for hind legs, and horned snake heads, in yellow and gold. Altogether, over 575 figures decorated the gate and the processional way that led through it. The processional way itself stretched for over half a kilometer, from the Ishtar Gate to the Esagila Temple complex in the city center. Its walls, 7 meters high, were decorated with 120 lions rendered in yellow and red glazed brick against blue backgrounds, symbols of Ishtar, goddess of love and war. Walking this route, especially during religious festivals when thousands participated in processions, must have been an overwhelming sensory experience. During the New Year festival, the most important celebration in the Babylonian calendar, the statue of Marduk would be carried from the Esagila temple through the Ishtar Gate and along the processional way to a temple outside the city, then returned in triumph. Thousands of citizens and visitors would line the route, watching the god pass, feeling their connection to divine power and to the city that served as his earthly dwelling. The technology required to create the glazed bricks used in these structures was itself impressive. Babylonian craftsmen had perfected a technique of applying colored glazes to bricks and firing them at high temperatures to create a hard, lustrous surface that would resist weathering. Different metallic compounds produced different colors: copper for turquoise and blue, iron for yellow, lead for white. The precision required to create thousands of identical bricks, each glazed in exactly the right shade, then assemble them into coherent images, speaks to an organizational and artistic capability that was extraordinary for its time. Modern archaeology has vindicated ancient descriptions. When German archaeologist Robert Koldewey excavated the Ishtar Gate between 1902 and 1914, he found it exactly where ancient texts placed it, buried under centuries of sand and debris. The gate had been dismantled during Islamic times, its bricks reused in other structures, but enough remained to reconstruct its original appearance. Sections were shipped to Berlin and reassembled in the Pergamon Museum, where they still astound visitors with their color and craftsmanship. But perhaps what's most remarkable about the Ishtar Gate and the processional way is what they reveal about Babylonian values. This was not merely defensive architecture or utilitarian construction. This was art on a monumental scale, a deliberate choice to invest enormous resources in creating beauty. The blue glazed bricks were far more expensive than regular fired brick, yet Nebuchadnezzar chose to use them lavishly, creating not just a gate, but a masterpiece. This speaks to a civilization at its height, confident enough in its power and security to invest in aesthetics, to care how things looked and felt, not just how effectively they functioned. The Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar was not merely powerful but cultured, not merely wealthy but refined. It represented the pinnacle of what ancient Mesopotamia, with 3 millennia of accumulated knowledge and achievement, could produce. And yet, standing before that magnificent blue gate, watching the sun glint off glazed brick, observing the eternal march of bulls and dragons towards some unknown destination, one might have felt a stirring of unease. There was something fragile about so much beauty, something vulnerable about perfection. This was a city at its apex, and history teaches that apexes are followed, inevitably, by decline. The Babylonians, for all their wisdom, for all the auguries their priests read in animal entrails and star positions, could not see the shadow approaching from the east, could not know that their greatest creation was also their last. In the annals of history, few moments shine as bright as Babylon in the early 6th century BCE. This was the city at its absolute pinnacle, the undisputed center of the civilized world, a metropolis that made all other cities seem provincial by comparison. The numbers alone are staggering. Babylon covered an area of nearly 10 square kilometers within its inner walls, with suburbs extending beyond for several more kilometers. The population estimates vary, but most scholars suggest somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 people lived within the city proper, with perhaps another 100,000 in the surrounding region. To put this in perspective, at this same period, Athens, which we think of as a great ancient city, held perhaps 40,000 people. Rome, which would later dominate the Mediterranean, was still a minor Italian town. Babylon dwarfed them all. The city was laid out with remarkable regularity for an ancient settlement. Unlike the organic, chaotic growth of most ancient cities, Babylon was planned, organized along rational principles that anticipated much later urban design. The Euphrates River divided the city into two parts, connected by a bridge, itself an engineering feat in an era before steel reinforcement. Streets ran in approximately straight lines, forming something approaching a grid pattern. Neighborhoods were organized by profession, with potters in one quarter, metal workers in another, merchants near the gates, the walls. Those massive fortifications that Nebuchadnezzar had built and rebuilt were themselves a wonder. Ancient Greek historian Herodotus, writing a century after Nebuchadnezzar's death, described them as so thick that a 4-horse chariot could turn around on top of them. Modern archaeology suggests Herodotus exaggerated, it seems to be what he did, but even the conservative estimates are impressive. Outer walls 7 meters thick, inner walls 12 meters thick, with dozens of guard towers rising even higher. Within these walls existed what was essentially a self-contained world. Babylon could withstand a siege of years if necessary, with grain storage sufficient to feed the population, wells providing water if the river was cut off, and workshops that could manufacture weapons and tools. The city was designed for survival, but it was also designed for glory. The skyline was dominated by ziggurats and palaces. The Etemenanke ziggurat rose 90 meters, visible from the horizon as travelers approached. Its 7 levels, each smaller than the one below and painted a different color, created a stairway to heaven that embodied Mesopotamian cosmic theology. The heavens were layered, each level the domain of different gods, and the ziggurat replicated this celestial structure on earth. At night, the city would have been spectacular. Oil lamps burned in thousands of windows. Torches lined the main streets. The temples were illuminated for evening rituals, their lights reflecting off glazed brick surfaces. From the top of the walls, guards could look out over a sea of flickering lights, the city spreading before them like a constellation brought down to earth. The daily life of Babylon was as complex as its architecture. In the marketplace near the Ishtar Gate, merchants from across the known world gathered. Phoenician traders arrived with purple-dyed cloth and cedar wood from Lebanon. Egyptian merchants brought papyrus and incense. Greeks offered olive oil and wine. From the east came spices, precious stones, and silk from distant lands whose names were whispered but whose locations remained mysterious. The air in the market would have been thick with voices speaking dozens of languages. Akkadian in its Babylonian dialect was the official tongue, but Aramaic was increasingly common, along with Hebrew, Phoenician, Egyptian, Elamite, Greek, and languages from peoples we can no longer identify. Babylon was perhaps the first truly cosmopolitan city, a place where the known world came together in all its diversity. The economic sophistication was remarkable. Banking families like the House of Egibi operated across the empire, providing loans, managing investments, facilitating trade. Credit instruments allowed merchants to conduct business without transporting heavy precious metals. Contracts were written in cuneiform on clay tablets, stamped with cylinder seals that served as signatures. The economic complexity rivaled anything that would exist until the Italian city-states of the Renaissance, 2,000 years later. Social stratification was stark but somewhat fluid. At the apex stood the royal family and high priests, living in palaces and managing vast estates. Below them came the administrative class, scribes and officials who kept the empire functioning. Merchants formed a wealthy middle class, some living in houses that approached palace luxury. Craftsmen and small traders occupied a comfortable if not lavish position. At the bottom were laborers and slaves, though even slavery in Babylon had regulations and protections that made it less brutal than in many later societies. Women in Babylon occupied a complex social position. Elite women could own property, engage in business, and wield influence through family connections. Female scribes existed, though they were rare. Priestesses served in temples, some holding significant power. But women remained legally subordinate to men, requiring male guardians for many transactions, subject to stricter penalties for adultery, valued primarily for their roles as wives and mothers. Education was prized, at least for those who could afford it. Temple schools trained boys to be scribes, a rigorous education that could take over a decade. Students learned the thousands of cuneiform signs, studied classic texts, practiced mathematics and astronomy. The educated elite of Babylon could read texts written 1,000 years earlier in Sumerian, could calculate compound interest, could predict eclipses. This was a literate civilization that valued knowledge and preserved it carefully. Religion permeated every aspect of life. The temples were not merely places of worship, but economic centers, social institutions, sources of education and charity. Priests performed daily rituals to appease the gods and maintain cosmic order. Festivals throughout the year marked agricultural seasons and mythological events. The New Year festival, celebrating Marduk's victory over chaos, involved 12 days of ceremonies, processions, and rituals that essentially reconsecrated the city and the cosmos. Yet beneath this splendor, contradictions festered. The wealth was built on conquest and tribute. The peace within the walls depended on brutal suppression of resistance outside them. The deported peoples who built Babylon's monuments did so in forced labor, though not technically slavery. The beauty was real, but it was purchased with suffering that the Babylonian aristocracy could safely ignore. Babylon believed itself eternal. How could it not? The city had existed for nearly 2,000 years. It had seen empires rise and fall. It had been conquered and had risen again. Its traditions stretched back into mythic time. Its gods were ancient beyond reckoning. The very soil of Mesopotamia was mixed with the ground bones of countless generations who had lived, worked, and died in the shadow of ziggurats. Surely, such a city, blessed by the gods, enriched by the labor of the known world, defended by walls that seemed impregnable, surely such a city would stand forever. The priests read the omens and saw nothing but continued prosperity. The merchants calculated future profits. The architects planned buildings that would take generations to complete. Everyone assumed tomorrow would be like today, only perhaps slightly better. They were wrong. Already, in the highlands of Persia to the east, a new power was rising under a king who would prove very different from those who had come before. Already the future was approaching, and it would arrive with surprising speed, transforming everything, ending 3,000 years of Mesopotamian dominance in a way none could have predicted. But for now, in this golden moment around 560 BCE, Babylon stood supreme, the greatest city on earth, the wonder of the world, the culmination of everything Mesopotamian civilization had achieved across 3 millennia. A place where humanity had pushed the boundaries of what was possible, creating beauty and order from the mud and chaos of the river plains. It would not last. Nothing does. But perhaps that impermanence is what makes greatness truly great. Babylon's glory shines all the brighter for being temporary, for being a moment of perfection achieved and then lost, leaving only ruins and memories and the eternal question, could it have been different? Could such magnificence have endured? The answer, as the sands of time would soon reveal, was no. But the attempt itself, the reaching towards something transcendent, something that might outlast its builders, that was worth everything. Time, that patient destroyer of all certainties, was about to deliver a lesson in impermanence. The Babylon that seemed eternal, that stood confident behind its massive walls, was about to fall in a manner so unexpected that it would become legend, whispered about in disbelief for generations. After Nebuchadnezzar's death in 562 BCE, Babylon entered a period of instability. His successors were weak, distracted by court intrigues and religious controversies. His son, Evil Merodach, ruled only 2 years before being murdered by his brother-in-law. The throne changed hands through violence and conspiracy. The empire that Nebuchadnezzar had built with such care began to show cracks in its foundation. In 556 BCE, power fell into the hands of Nabonidus, an aging aristocrat and scholar with a dangerous obsession. Nabonidus was fascinated by the moon god Sin rather than Babylon's patron deity Marduk, and he spent years away from Babylon pursuing archaeological interests in Arabia, leaving his son Belshazzar to rule as regent. This religious eccentricity alienated the powerful priesthood of Marduk, creating divisions within Babylonian society at precisely the moment when unity was most needed. For in the east, beyond the Zagros Mountains, something unprecedented was taking shape. A Persian tribal leader named Cyrus, ruler of the small kingdom of Anshan, had begun a career of conquest that would reshape the ancient world. In 550 BCE, Cyrus overthrew his Median overlords and seized control of their empire. Within a decade, he had conquered Lydia in Anatolia, bringing Greek cities of the Ionian coast under Persian control. His empire stretched from the Mediterranean to India, from the steppes of Central Asia to the Persian Gulf. And now, in 539 BCE, Cyrus turned his attention to Babylon. The Babylonians seemed unconcerned. Their walls had never been breached. Their god Marduk had protected them for millennia. What could some Persian upstart possibly do against the greatest city on earth? Nabonidus returned from his Arabian sojourn and prepared for a siege that he believed would end like all previous sieges, with the attackers giving up in frustration. But Cyrus was a different kind of conqueror. He understood that cities fall not just through military might, but through internal division, through offering something better than resistance. His propaganda portrayed him not as an enemy of Babylon, but as a liberator, chosen by Marduk himself to restore proper worship and end Nabonidus's religious innovations. He promised to respect Babylonian traditions, to maintain their temples, to govern with justice rather than oppression. The disaffected priesthood of Marduk listened. The people, weary of Nabonidus's eccentricities and his son Belshazzar's harsh rule, listened. And when Cyrus's general Ogbaru advanced on Babylon with a Persian army, something remarkable happened. The city surrendered without a fight. The biblical book of Daniel tells a dramatic story of Belshazzar's feast, of mysterious writing appearing on the palace wall, Mene Tekel Uparsin, foretelling doom, of the city falling that very night. The reality was perhaps less theatrical but more profound. On October 12, 539 BCE, Persian forces entered Babylon through gates opened from within. There was no battle, no desperate defense, no heroic last stand. The greatest city on earth simply changed masters, as easily as a merchant might change a worn cloak for a new one. Nabonidus was captured, but treated with surprising leniency, given a comfortable retirement rather than execution. Belshazzar disappears from the historical record, his fate unknown. The massive walls, the impregnable defenses, the divine protection, none of it mattered when the city chose not to fight. When Cyrus himself entered Babylon 3 weeks later, he came not as a conqueror, but as a restorer of order. He immediately began issuing proclamations emphasizing continuity rather than change. He presented himself as chosen by Marduk, performed the proper rituals, and promised to maintain Babylonian traditions. The famous Cyrus cylinder, discovered by archaeologists in the ruins of Babylon, records his clemency. "I returned the images of the gods to their sanctuaries. I gathered all their peoples and returned them to their dwelling places." This policy extended to the deported Jews who had lived in Babylon since Nebuchadnezzar's conquest. Cyrus issued a decree allowing them to return to Judea and rebuild their temple, a policy recorded both in the Hebrew Bible and in Persian sources. Many Jews chose to remain in Babylon, which had become home, but those who returned carried with them memories of exile that would shape Judaism forever. Babylon continued to exist, even to prosper, under Persian rule. It remained a major city, a center of trade and learning, but it was no longer the capital, no longer the center of the world. That distinction had passed to Persian cities, Pasargadae, Susa, Persepolis. Babylon became a provincial capital in an empire whose heart lay elsewhere. The ease of Babylon's fall was itself revolutionary. For 3,000 years, Mesopotamian civilization had assumed that military power was paramount, that massive walls and fierce armies determined who ruled. Cyrus demonstrated something different, that empires could be conquered through tolerance and propaganda, that offering better governance could be more effective than battering rams, that the consent of the governed mattered even in absolute monarchy. The Persian Empire that absorbed Babylon was fundamentally different from previous Near Eastern empires. Where Assyria had ruled through terror and Babylon through cultural prestige, Persia ruled through administrative efficiency and relative tolerance. Different peoples maintained their languages, religions, and customs. The empire was divided into satrapies governed by appointed officials but allowed considerable local autonomy. A royal road system connected distant provinces. A postal service carried messages across thousands of kilometers. Standard coinage facilitated trade. This was a new model of empire, more sophisticated and potentially more durable than anything that had come before. And it had swallowed Mesopotamia almost without bloodshed, incorporating 3 millennia of civilization into a larger Persian whole. The psychological impact on Mesopotamians must have been profound. Their gods, they had believed, were supreme. Their civilization was the oldest and greatest. Their cities were eternal. And yet, in a single day, all of this had been revealed as illusion. Marduk had not protected Babylon. The walls had not saved them. Eternity had ended with barely a whimper. Perhaps some of the more thoughtful Babylonians understood that their city's fall was in some sense inevitable. Civilizations, like individuals, have life cycles. They are born in hardship, grow through innovation, peak in confidence, and decline as the very success that brought greatness creates complacency and internal contradiction. Babylon in 539 BCE was no longer the hungry, innovative city that Hammurabi had built or that Nebuchadnezzar had glorified. It was comfortable, traditional, certain of its superiority, unable to imagine that the world had changed around it. The Persian conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE marks a symbolic end to Mesopotamian independence. Never again would the region be ruled by people who spoke Akkadian or worshipped Marduk as supreme. Never again would Babylon or any Mesopotamian city be the center of a great empire. The torch had passed first to Persia and eventually to peoples and places that would have seemed impossibly distant to the original Sumerian city builders. But the story was not quite finished. One more act remained, one more transformation that would complete Mesopotamia's journey from the cradle of civilization to a backwater of someone else's empire. That final chapter would be written by a young Macedonian king whose ambitions exceeded even those of Cyrus, who dreamed not just of an empire but of uniting all humanity under one rule, one culture, one vision. His name was Alexander, and his arrival would mark both an ending and a beginning, the death of ancient Mesopotamia and the birth of a new world. As one chapter closed, another, stranger still, began. For 2 centuries, Babylon lived under Persian rule, prosperous but provincial, important but no longer paramount. The old Mesopotamian gods still received their offerings in temples maintained by ancient ritual. Cuneiform scribes still recorded contracts and astronomical observations. Life continued in patterns established over millennia. But the vitality was draining away, like water seeping into desert sand. Then, in the spring of 331 BCE, news arrived that would shake the ancient world. A young Macedonian king named Alexander was marching east, and before him the mighty Persian Empire was collapsing like a house of cards. Alexander III of Macedon, whom history would call the Great, was 25 years old when he arrived in Mesopotamia. He had already conquered Greece, Asia Minor, and Egypt. He had defeated Persian armies at Granicus and Issus. Now he sought the ultimate prize, the Persian heartland itself, and with it, mastery of the civilized world. On October 1st, 331 BCE, at Gaugamela in northern Mesopotamia, Alexander faced Darius III, the Persian king, in a battle that would determine the fate of empires. Darius commanded perhaps 250,000 men. The exact numbers are disputed, including elite cavalry, war elephants, and scythed chariots designed to break infantry formations. Alexander had perhaps 50,000 troops, outnumbered but superbly trained and led. The battle raged for hours. Darius's chariots proved ineffective against disciplined Macedonian infantry, who simply opened ranks to let them pass through. Alexander, seeing an opening in the Persian line, led his companion cavalry in a wedge formation directly toward Darius himself. The Persian king, seeing death approaching in the form of a young man with eyes like fire, turned and fled. His army, seeing their king retreat, dissolved into panic and rout. Mesopotamia's fate was decided in that moment, not by the wisdom of priests or the thickness of walls, not by the favor of Marduk or the strength of ancient tradition, but by the courage and genius of a young Macedonian who led from the front and inspired his men to believe the impossible was achievable. Alexander entered Babylon on October 20, 331 BCE, and in this moment we see the passing of an entire world. The Babylonians opened their gates as they had for Cyrus 2 centuries before. The satrap of Babylon surrendered the city and its treasure, 50,000 talents of silver, an almost incomprehensible fortune. Priests of Marduk welcomed Alexander as a liberator, declaring him chosen by their god, just as they had declared for Cyrus, just as they would have declared for anyone who held power. But Alexander was different from previous conquerors. He came from a Greek culture that saw Mesopotamia as ancient, exotic, the source of mysterious wisdom. He was a student of Aristotle, fascinated by philosophy, convinced that he had a divine mission to unite East and West into a single civilization. He ordered the restoration of temples, including the Esagila dedicated to Marduk. He participated in Babylonian religious ceremonies, respecting traditions that stretched back 3,000 years. Yet even as Alexander honored Mesopotamian customs, he was transforming them. Greek became the language of administration alongside Akkadian. Macedonian veterans settled in Mesopotamia, intermarrying with local populations. Greek philosophy and science mingled with Babylonian astronomy and mathematics. A new hybrid culture was being born, what historians would later call Hellenistic civilization. Neither fully Greek nor fully Near Eastern, but something unprecedented. Alexander stayed in Babylon for a month before marching east to conquer the rest of the Persian Empire. He pursued Darius into the mountains, witnessed that king's murder by his own nobles, and continued onward to India, to the very edge of the known world, before his exhausted troops finally refused to go further. He turned back, retracing his path, and returned to Babylon in 323 BCE. He chose Babylon as his capital. From here, he planned to rule the largest empire yet assembled, stretching from Greece to India. He began ambitious projects, draining swamps, building harbors, opening trade routes, planning cities. He dreamed of an empire where Greek and Persian, Macedonian and Babylonian would merge into a new humanity united by shared culture and common purpose. But the gods, if they existed, had other plans. In June 323 BCE, after a banquet, Alexander fell ill. Fever consumed him. For 10 days he struggled, his condition worsening each day. His generals gathered around his bed, watching their invincible leader succumb to something invisible, something that all his courage and genius could not defeat. Perhaps it was malaria, perhaps typhoid, perhaps poison. Historians still debate. What matters is that on June 10 or 11, 323 BCE, in a palace in Babylon, Alexander died. He was 32 years old. The timing and location seem almost deliberately symbolic. Alexander died in Babylon, the most ancient of cities, the place where civilization began. His death there marked the end, not just of his dreams, but of something larger, the independent existence of Mesopotamian civilization as a distinct entity. His generals, gathered in Babylon for his funeral, immediately began quarreling over who would inherit his empire. The wars of the Diadochi, the successor wars, would rage for decades, tearing Alexander's empire apart into competing kingdoms. Seleucus, one of Alexander's generals, eventually gained control of Mesopotamia and founded the Seleucid Empire, ruling from Syria rather than from Babylon. Under Seleucid rule, Babylon began its final decline. In 305 BCE, Seleucus I founded a new capital, Seleucia on the Tigris, about 60 kilometers north of Babylon. Population, resources, and prestige flowed to this new Greek city. Babylon was slowly abandoned, its population drifting away, its temples falling silent, its great buildings crumbling from neglect. By 275 BCE, much of Babylon was deserted. The Esagila temple still functioned, but most neighborhoods were empty, haunted by memories and ghosts. The last dated cuneiform tablet from Babylon was written in 75 CE, nearly 3 centuries after Alexander's death. After that silence, the language that had been written for 3,000 years, that had recorded the first human stories, the first laws, the first accounting of human achievement, that language died. The last person who could read cuneiform forgot their skill and passed away, leaving behind millions of tablets that would remain incomprehensible for 2 millennia. Babylon itself gradually disappeared beneath the sand. The mud bricks that had built such magnificence, lacking stone's permanence, eroded back into the earth from which they came. The hanging gardens, if they ever existed, vanished without trace. The Ishtar Gate was dismantled. The Etemenanke ziggurat collapsed into an enormous mound. The palace where Nebuchadnezzar had planned his conquests became home to jackals and owls. By the medieval period, the location of Babylon was uncertain. Travelers could point to massive mounds of earth near the Euphrates and say, that was once Babylon, but the specifics were lost. The city became legend more than history, remembered primarily through biblical prophecies of its fall and Greek tales of its wonders. It became a metaphor for human pride and divine judgment, for the impermanence of all earthly glory, and yet something of Mesopotamia survived. The astronomical observations of Babylonian priests, recorded over centuries, were transmitted to the Greeks and preserved. The mathematical system based on 60, the division of circles and time, persisted. The wheel, the plough, writing itself, these fundamental innovations spread across the world. The Epic of Gilgamesh, buried in Ashurbanipal's library, waited in the earth for archaeologists to rediscover it. More subtly, Mesopotamian ideas influenced the religions that would dominate the Western world. The biblical creation story echoes the Enuma Elish. The flood narrative in Genesis parallels Mesopotamian flood myths. Legal codes from the Bible show influence from Hammurabi's laws. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all born in the Middle East, all carry within them traces of Mesopotamian thought, Mesopotamian stories, Mesopotamian dreams. Alexander's death in Babylon was symbolic in ways he could not have known. He represented the future, young, dynamic, looking westward to Greece and eastward to India, dreaming of something new. Babylon represented the past, ancient, traditional, rooted in 3 millennia of accumulated wisdom. His death in Babylon was the moment when past and future met, when one world ended and another began. The twilight of the gods had come at last. Marduk and Ishtar, Enlil and Enki, the deities who had watched over Mesopotamia since the Sumerians first built their ziggurats, faded from human memory. New gods, Zeus and Athena, eventually Yahweh and Christ and Allah, took their place in human hearts. The sacred language of cuneiform gave way to Greek alphabets and Aramaic scripts. The old ways, the ancient traditions, the accumulated wisdom of 3,000 years of continuous civilization, all slipped beneath the surface of history like a great ship sinking into dark waters. But the ship left ripples that spread outward, touching distant shores, shaping the world in ways both visible and invisible. We are all children of Mesopotamia, whether we know it or not. We live in cities they invented, write in scripts descended from their cuneiform, divide our time by numbers they chose, tell stories whose archetypes they first recorded in clay.